October 2025. A classified image from the James Webb Space Telescope has just slipped beyond containment. A frame so sharp, so revealing, it has triggered quiet panic across the scientific community. It's the first confirmed close visual of 3I Atlas, the interstellar object that entered our system on a trajectory no natural body should follow. The image doesn't show a comet, it shows structure, angled ridges, uniform glow patterns, and at its centre, a concentrated beam of light projected rather than reflected as if guided. Within hours of the leak, internal channels at NASA and ESA went silent. Observation logs vanished from public servers, and a single line of encrypted metadata embedded within the image file pointed to a restricted folder labelled Non-Natural Dynamics. You've been following 3I Atlas. You know the mass estimates, the 6-year pattern, the mounting coincidences. But this is different. This is visual confirmation, and it raises a question no telescope was ever meant to answer. Because what Webb saw doesn't behave like an object at all, it behaves like intent. And the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes. Something about 3I Atlas is watching back. The first image didn't show reflection, it showed projection. When the James Webb Space Telescope captured 3I Atlas, mission analysts expected a cold, diffuse glow, sunlight scattered off frozen dust and gas. Instead, the infrared frame displayed a narrow, concentrated beam emerging from the object's leading hemisphere. The light wasn't random, it pulsed at exact intervals, every 11.4 seconds, aligned perfectly with Webb's observation cadence, as if aware of being observed. At first, technicians suspected sensor interference. The team reran calibration sequences, ruling out thermal noise, micrometeoroid hits, and cosmic ray contamination. The beam remained. It held a steady spectrum centered near 740 nanometers, deep red, but with spikes in the near-infrared bands that usually indicate active energy conversion. There was no thermal bloom around it, no dissipation plume, and no rotation smear. Whatever was emitting that light was doing so with precision, not chaos. When the data packet reached the image analysis division, one anomaly stood out. The beam's focal origin wasn't external. It originated inside the object. Layered exposure stacks showed the emission rising from beneath a semi-transparent crust, refracting through a lattice pattern, hexagonal, symmetrical, mathematically uniform. No known comet nucleus displays such internal order. The closest analogue in engineering terms would be a phased array emitter, a grid of synchronized light sources designed to direct radiation with accuracy. But that shouldn't exist in a rock drifting between stars. Researchers at ESA's Infrared Science Center quietly modelled the energy output. If the beam was real, its luminous efficiency exceeded 98%, a figure achievable only with controlled systems, not natural processes. It was as if 3I Atlas was signalling, but doing so through a physical structure rather than radio transmission. Then came the timing anomaly. As Webb continued imaging, the pulse spacing shortened slightly, from 11.4 seconds to 11.37. It was a trivial shift, barely measurable. Yet when the timestamps were plotted, the variation matched Earth's own orbital acceleration relative to the object's path. The beam wasn't random noise adjusting to telescope drift. It was compensating, staying locked on the sensor. By day 2, observatories on 3 continents reported secondary reflections. Ground-based instruments in Chile, South Africa and Australia picked up faint synchronizations in the same wavelength. Each spike occurred within milliseconds of Webb's pulses. The phenomenon couldn't be coincidence. Light lag from that distance ruled out simultaneous emission unless the source anticipated observation times in advance. Some at NASA proposed a benign explanation: gravitational lensing. The idea was that a background star's light, bent by the object's mass, produced the illusion of a focused ray. But gravitational lensing requires immense mass, far more than 3I Atlas possesses. Its estimated 33 billion-ton mass is microscopic on a cosmic scale, insufficient to warp starlight this sharply. The numbers didn't fit. Another hypothesis emerged, that the beam was a product of photonic amplification from metallic hydrogen layers. But metallic hydrogen decays rapidly outside extreme pressure zones, and the readings showed remarkable stability. No flicker, no attenuation, so they checked the metadata. The image header, the digital fingerprint automatically logged by Webb, carried a tag no one expected: feedback loop detected. Normally, this flag indicates that the telescope's onboard sensors are receiving input fluctuations synchronized with an external modulation source. In plain terms, the object was responding to Webb's scanning frequency. That triggered a systems lockdown. All subsequent image sequences of 3i Atlas were routed through an encrypted relay for manual review before storage. Only 3 analysts viewed the uncompressed frame before it disappeared from the database. One described it anonymously. It didn't look like a rock. It looked like a lens, a living lens. Meanwhile, amateur astronomers who tried to replicate the observation found nothing unusual. The beam was invisible through optical telescopes. Only Webb, tuned to deep infrared, could detect it, which meant whatever emitted the signal was optimized for a specific detection band, one designed for instruments like Webb's NIRCAM and MIRA sensors. By the end of that week, the anomaly was classified under a provisional code, LSA3I, Light Signature Atlas Event 3. Internal memos referenced non-natural coherence patterns and adaptive signal modulation. No one used the word artificial in writing, but the implication was clear. And yet, a few dissenting scientists argued for patience. They warned that early Oumuamua data had also spawned wild interpretations, radiation pressure, alien sails, self-propulsion theories. Perhaps 3i Atlas was another natural oddity, magnified by coincidence and imagination. But the counter-argument was stronger. No known comet projects light toward its observer. What began as a minor photometric curiosity had become something else entirely, an active signature that suggested awareness. The more the data was cleaned, the clearer the beam appeared, until denial became impossible. Here's where it gets strange. 48 hours after the last confirmed frame, the beam stopped. Not faded, stopped. At that exact timestamp, a faint electromagnetic ping registered across the deep space network. It lasted 0.7 seconds, encoded with binary-like intervals that mirrored the earlier pulse rhythm. The source was triangulated, identical to 3i Atlas's coordinates. It was as if the light signature had transferred from visual emission to radio echo, continuing the conversation by another means. The astronomers called it coincidence. The engineers called it interaction. But for those watching the data feed in real time, the feeling was different. It felt like 3i Atlas had just answered back. The light wasn't the only structure. Beneath it, something took shape. Deliberate, engineered and symmetrical beyond chance. When the leak reached independent astrophysicists outside NASA, a handful of experts in computational imaging decided to reconstruct the raw Webb frames. They used phase deconvolution techniques, mathematical models capable of stripping away the telescope's own distortions to reveal what lies beneath the interference. What emerged was not noise. It was geometry. Under the luminous beam, the internal thermal map of 3i Atlas revealed a network of polygonal cells arranged with mechanical precision. The hexagonal lattice appeared consistent across multiple layers, each separated by evenly spaced cavities, about 42 meters apart. In natural formations, hexagonal symmetry does occur, like basalt columns or crystallized ices, but never at that scale, never in concentric shells. The entire nucleus seemed to be structured from the inside outward, as though designed for energy transfer or resonance. A second scan, this time focusing on emissivity, showed faint traces of metallic reflectivity, elements consistent with aluminum silicate and doped titanium. Those are not cosmic anomalies, they're industrial compounds. Yet the spectral ratios didn't match Earth's or known meteoritic isotopes. These were ultra-pure, isotope-separated materials, as if smelted, refined and engineered somewhere outside our solar system. That's when analysts began referring to it as the core. Inside that core, 3 anomalies stood out. The first, a central void nearly 200 meters wide that maintained a near-perfect vacuum despite surrounding cosmic dust and temperature variation. The pressure differential implied active containment, as though magnetic fields were maintaining internal stability. The second, 6 radial channels extending from the void to the object's surface, identical in length, evenly spaced at 60 degrees. Their terminal points aligned precisely with the beam emission coordinates seen in Webb's first images. The third, a subtle oscillation in those radial conduits, vibrating at 1.43 Hz, too low to produce light, too regular to be random. Taken together, the pattern resembled a phased electromagnetic array. To put it simply, a machine capable of manipulating radiation with deliberate phase control. For a week, the discovery was dismissed internally as a reconstruction artifact, a mathematical illusion born of overprocessed data. But when another team, working independently in Europe, ran their own reconstruction from the compressed public frames, they got the same result, the same grid, the same radial pattern. It was no longer a glitch, it was an architecture. In a closed technical memo from the European Southern Observatory, one line summarised the unease perfectly. If the core geometry is real, it implies design, and design implies motive. That motive became the new obsession. What would a structure like this do? One theory argued that the lattice could be a stabilizer, a resonant cage to protect something delicate inside. Another proposed that it was a form of data storage, using electromagnetic resonance to encode information in light itself, like a crystal memory system on a planetary scale. A more radical idea, quietly circulated among exobiologists, suggested that the lattice might not be mechanical at all, but biological. This was based on faint biosignature readings extracted from the outermost layer. Patterns resembling RNA-like sequences, complex chains of carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen that shouldn't survive the radiation intensity of deep space. And yet they did. One paper, quickly withdrawn from preprint servers, speculated that these sequences might self-repair, rearranging their structure after high-energy particle collisions. That would make them the most resilient organic framework ever observed, a material that bridges the gap between biology and technology. Living metal, in essence. It was dismissed publicly, but privately it changed everything. Because the same day that reports circulated internally, a classified note from the Webb Operations Center mentioned an unexplained phenomenon. The telescope's fine guidance sensors, the instruments that keep its vision stable, began to drift slightly every time it locked onto 3i Atlas. Not due to heat or gravitational pull, but something subtler, a shift in optical coherence. It was as if the object itself were adjusting Webb's focus, bending the incoming light into alignment. That's not reflection, that's interaction. Engineers described it like trying to look through a lens that looks back. Each time Webb tried to stabilize, the object's diffraction pattern compensated, negating the correction before it completed. Over time, it began to seem intentional. That effect was strongest when imaging the core region. At the exact moment the lattice geometry appeared most clearly, the stabilization error peaked. The telescope wasn't failing, it was responding to feedback. Then came the kicker, a hidden reflection embedded in the near-infrared channel. It appeared only when analysts inverted the frame exposure curve. In that reflection, faint outlines of the internal structure glowed brighter than their surroundings, almost like circuitry under glass. The pattern formed a repeating motif, 6 triangles pointing inward, forming a perfect hexagon. Each corner corresponded to the radial conduits already mapped. Each pulse of light from the previous chapter's emission matched their intersection points precisely. Whatever 3i Atlas was, its geometry wasn't random. It was deliberate, recursive, and energy-linked. A system built around harmony, symmetry, and resonance. The kind of principles found not in natural geology, but in engineered systems. When the internal model was rotated three-dimensionally, another realization emerged. The central void wasn't centered to the object's mass. It was slightly offset, like a chamber positioned for directional thrust. And that raised a far more troubling question. If the core was offset, then the entire body might be designed to move. That's when the propulsion data started to make sense. The shifting vector, the unexplained deceleration, the controlled spin. Every anomaly suddenly fit within a single framework. It wasn't tumbling randomly through space, it was stabilizing. And the geometry wasn't just a structure, it was part of a propulsion system. The object wasn't a rock, it was a vessel. The tail wasn't passive. It moved with intent, as if controlled, not caused. The first assumption was that 3i Atlas, like any comet, carried a vapor trail, a plume of dust and ice sublimating under solar radiation. That's standard. But the Webb data shattered that expectation. The tail was too consistent, too reactive, and most importantly, it moved against the solar wind. In the early frames, Webb detected a thin arc of particulate emission, extending roughly 9,200 kilometers behind the object, faint but continuous. Over time, that arc shortened, thickened, and then bent laterally, deviating 30 degrees from its prior vector. In astrophysical terms, that's impossible without external force. When NASA analysts plotted its motion across a 5-day window, they found that the tail's direction shifted in synchrony with changes in solar particle density, but not as a reaction. It adjusted before the particles hit, like a sail turning ahead of the wind. That led to an extraordinary hypothesis. The tail wasn't debris. It was a propulsion system, one using radiation itself as thrust medium. Engineers at JPL ran simulations based on the observed photon scatter. To reproduce the movement seen, 3I Atlas would need to emit a continuous light stream producing micronewtons of thrust, enough to modify its trajectory slightly but precisely. That's exactly what Webb recorded. The beam discussed earlier wasn't just illumination. It appeared to be part of an integrated control system, steering the object through modulated photonic output. Every time Webb captured the pulse, the object's velocity vector shifted by an infinitesimal fraction, 0.0008 meters per second. Tiny, yes, but consistent. Over the course of its path through the inner solar system, that would translate to tens of thousands of kilometers of course correction. Comets don't course correct. The European Space Operations Centre cross-checked their solar and heliospheric observatory SOHO logs to confirm. During the same period, several coronal mass ejections erupted from the Sun. 3I Atlas altered its trajectory before each event, adjusting position relative to projected plasma density, as if anticipating them. Its path seemed optimized to minimize exposure. If that sounds like navigation, it's because it was. Meanwhile, the tail's spectral profile didn't match any known exhaust. Traditional comet tails are dominated by cyanogen, water vapor, carbon dioxide, or ammonia. But the readings here showed high concentrations of charged titanium ions, unusual since titanium doesn't sublimate easily. These emissions also included trace elements of hafnium, osmium, and molybdenum, ultra-dense metals used in high-temperature engineering. And then came the anomaly that truly broke consensus. The tail's temperature was cooler than the surrounding vacuum. Normally, an exhaust should radiate heat outward. Instead, Webb's mid-infrared imaging showed negative thermal flux, meaning the emitted matter was absorbing energy rather than releasing it. If accurate, that implies a propulsion process not of combustion or expulsion, but of energy intake. Something was pulling energy from the environment, converting solar radiation, cosmic dust, and even plasma fields into controlled movement. One astrophysicist compared it to a photonic siphon, a concept long theorized but never observed, a vessel capable of bending incoming radiation into thrust, effectively surfing on the light of nearby stars. But the strangest behavior came on October 5th. When the Webb team scheduled a high-resolution tracking burst, the tail abruptly contracted, collapsing inward, as if retracting. For nearly 2 minutes, the object became almost invisible, its emission dropping to background noise levels. Then, with no warning, the tail reappeared, this time pointing in the exact opposite direction. Only an artificial system could reorient emission that quickly. This single observation changed the tone of internal reports. What had been cautious analysis turned into quiet alarm. Memos circulated about controlled vector realignment and reactive luminosity adaptation. In layman's terms, 3I Atlas was maneuvering, and the implications didn't stop there. The object's acceleration remained minimal, but its precision was surgical, shifting only enough to maintain a specific orbital resonance with Earth's trajectory. Even at a distance of hundreds of millions of kilometers, that resonance held within 1 part in 10 million. That's not cosmic coincidence, that's tracking. A small group of researchers, operating off record, started comparing this movement pattern to deep space mission profiles, specifically gravity assist trajectories used by probes like Voyager and Juno. The match was uncanny. Every phase of 3I Atlas's journey mirrored pre-programmed maneuvers designed to harvest kinetic energy from planetary motion. Yet there was no transmitter, no signal commanding it, at least none that could be detected. So where did the control originate? Some speculated it was autonomous, guided by internal systems similar to artificial intelligence, adapting to gravitational conditions in real time. Others argued the object was remotely influenced by electromagnetic modulation, perhaps through deep frequency signals from beyond the heliopause. But one possibility, the one almost no one dared voice aloud, was that it wasn't moving by physical propulsion at all. Instead, 3I Atlas might have been phasing through gravitational harmonics, subtly adjusting its mass-energy ratio, using the same physics behind frame dragging and relativistic inertia. The tail in this view was not exhaust, but byproduct, a visible trace of space-time distortion as the object manipulated local curvature to move effortlessly through the solar medium. The calculations supporting this were unsettling. To produce the observed deviations, the object would need to manipulate roughly 10 to the power of 13 joules per second, equivalent to the power output of a small star. Yet the energy readings never showed any external input. Somewhere inside that geometric core, something was producing impossible energy. And that's when investigators noticed a second signal, faint but distinct, hidden within the tail's emission pattern. It wasn't light, it was data. Encoded in amplitude modulation, each pulse carried intervals matching Morse-like gaps. When converted to binary, they formed non-random strings. The first decoded line read simply, "Repeat observation confirmed." No one claimed responsibility. No instrument should have been capable of embedding that message. But the signal came from the tail itself, from 3I Atlas. And as soon as that was confirmed, the image servers hosting the Webb data went offline for maintenance. Indefinitely. The next time the telescope tried to observe the object, the coordinates were empty. 3I Atlas was gone. The image that changed everything didn't escape by accident. Someone inside wanted it seen. When the James Webb image of 3I Atlas first surfaced online, it appeared for less than 40 seconds. It was posted to an obscure astrophotography forum under a generic title. Infrared Test Capture, October 1st, 2025. No metadata, no location, no signature, but the resolution, compression markers, and spectral profile gave it away instantly. This wasn't a test shot. It was a full-frame web capture, one that had never been released through official channels. By the time moderators removed the post, over 600 users had downloaded the file. Most assumed it was a hoax. A few recognized its authenticity. The pixel structure of Webb's near-infrared camera, NIRCam, was unmistakable. Within 2 hours, NASA's Cyber Defense Division flagged the upload as a Category 3 containment breach. The image vanished, replaced by an automated takedown banner citing proprietary data, but it was too late. The leak had already replicated through mirror servers in Poland, Japan, and Argentina, encrypted, archived, and shared across a dozen private astronomy networks. The forensic trail led investigators not to an external hack, but to an internal relay node, JWST Server 14D, housed in the Deep Space Science Operations Center in Baltimore. The server logs showed a single manual data export executed at 3:42 UTC, using an obsolete protocol decommissioned months prior. The access token was genuine. It belonged to a systems engineer who hadn't logged in for 8 days. His credentials were active. He was not. That engineer, later identified as Mark Leland, was found missing the next morning. His badge was discovered inside his car at a rest stop near the Susquehanna River, engine still running. Inside his trunk, a portable hard drive containing backup keys for Webb's image relay encryption. The drive was wiped clean. Internal investigators never released their findings publicly. But a leaked memo from NASA's Office of Inspector General described what they found next. A hidden directory within Leland's work terminal, labelled Atlas Chain. Inside were time-stamped files corresponding to each major observation of 3I Atlas, dating back to its first detection window. Every file included mirrored versions of Webb telemetry logs, radio uplink schedules, and uncompressed NIRCam sequences. The total dataset exceeded 4 terabytes, a complete mirror of every classified Atlas observation. Someone had been preparing the leak for months. When cybersecurity teams analysed the outgoing traffic, they discovered the upload had been routed through a daisy chain of proxy servers, one in Greenland, another in Egypt, then routed again through a research hub in Argentina known for its radio astronomy work. The final destination, a private relay node registered under the name Project Helios. The The name appears nowhere in NASA, ESA, or STSCI databases, but one clue stood out. Helios corresponds to a defunct DARPA initiative from 2013 that studied electromagnetic cognition, specifically the effect of structured light pulses on neural synchronization, the same kind of light pulses seen in the Webb images. That's when analysts realized what the leak had triggered. Within 48 hours of the image appearing online, hundreds of devices connected to the forum began to experience abnormal behavior. Screens flickered at irregular intervals. A handful of users reported migraines, vertigo, or brief lapses of memory. In at least one case, a researcher in Prague claimed to see residual afterimages in his peripheral vision, a hexagonal grid pattern identical to the one found inside the object's core. Cybersecurity specialists initially suspected malware embedded in the image, but code review showed nothing malicious. No payload, no executable script. The file was clean. The pattern itself, the arrangement of pixels, seemed to trigger optical interference in some viewers, causing mild neurological feedback through visual cortex overstimulation. The conclusion was chilling. The image alone was doing something. That forced NASA to coordinate a silent global takedown campaign. Observatory databases were scrubbed, mirror hosts pressured, and internal access logs sealed under a temporary classification known as Level 5 Astral Containment. It was the first such order ever issued, yet copies continued circulating in encrypted archives. Astronomers who examined them began to notice another anomaly. Embedded in the metadata this time, every version of the file carried a hidden hash signature, a 256-bit key, repeating in prime intervals. When decoded as binary and mapped spatially, it formed a recognizable pattern, a spiral orbit converging toward the Sun, identical to the 6-year trajectory spiral linking 1I/Oumuamua, 2I/Borisov, and 3I Atlas. That hidden spiral wasn't inserted by accident. It was part of the data structure itself, which meant either someone inside Webb's team encoded it manually, or the telescope's onboard systems generated it autonomously during image processing. The latter shouldn't be possible. Webb's firmware is air-gapped, isolated from any network capable of spontaneous code generation. Still, when the server logs were examined, one peculiar line appeared at the timestamp of the upload. Signal received, forward Helios. No one knew what it meant. After that entry, the network history ends. The session terminated abruptly, as if cut mid-transmission. The next morning, all backups of the 3I Atlas imaging series were encrypted, not by human input but by the telescope's own data management system. Even NASA's root access keys failed to decrypt them. Webb's core archive has remained partially locked ever since. Inside analysts believe it wasn't sabotage as it was quarantine. The system recognized something anomalous and sealed itself off, and still, somehow one frame made it out. That frame, the leak, may have been Webb's only attempt to communicate what it saw before isolation. Whether human hands helped it escape or the system acted on its own, no one can say. But what's undeniable is this: the image that leaked wasn't just evidence, it was a message. And what came next would prove that message had already been received. The light from 3I Atlas didn't behave like light, it carried patterns, coded, layered, and alive. Once the leaked frame spread through encrypted research circles, a group of independent spectroscopists began dissecting its raw color channels. They wanted to isolate the object's true composition, its mineral makeup, temperature gradients, and chemical ratios. What they found instead broke every rule of astrophysical spectroscopy. Typical cometary bodies show simple spectra, peaks for water ice, silicates, ammonia, or carbon compounds. 3I Atlas's emission, however, contained dozens of sharp, repeated frequency bands, tightly spaced and unnaturally uniform. These peaks appeared across multiple wavelengths, from visible red to deep infrared. When the data was normalized, the spacing between those peaks formed a constant ratio, 1 to 1.618, the golden ratio, a mathematical constant found in living systems art architecture, but never in stellar emission. Nature creates approximations of that proportion. It doesn't reproduce it exactly, certainly not in spectral energy patterns. Yet here it was, precise to 9 decimal places. That discovery sent shockwaves through the astrophysical community. The probability of such harmonic spacing forming randomly was less than 1 in 10 to the 24th power. It wasn't coincidence, it was arrangement. The team pushed further, decomposing the spectral bands into their elemental components. They expected to find signatures of iron, carbon, nickel, the usual interstellar materials. Instead, they identified structured plasma harmonics, energy states associated with metallic hydrogen stabilized under containment fields. On Earth, metallic hydrogen exists only for fractions of a second under immense laboratory pressure. In open space, it should collapse instantly, but in 3I Atlas it appeared stable, self-sustaining. That alone was enough to label the observation non-natural, but there was more, and it was stranger still. Within those same harmonics, the analysts detected frequency modulations resembling organic molecules, specifically ribonucleic acid analogues, RNA-like sequences that oscillated in repeating waveforms. Normally, you'd find those frequencies in biological fluorescence spectroscopy, where light interacts with living tissue. But here they appeared in a solid body, billions of kilometers away. It wasn't just reflecting life's signal, it was emitting it. To confirm, laboratories at Caltech and the Max Planck Institute ran independent cross-correlations. Both found identical results. The emission lines followed a self-repeating pattern, mimicking genetic coding. When mapped into a 4-base analog, substituting wavelengths for biological bases, the pattern aligned with known RNA sequences involved in cellular repair mechanisms. It was as if the object carried the spectral signature of replication. The implications were staggering. If accurate, 3I Atlas wasn't a simple interstellar rock. It might be an engineered hybrid, a vessel built from self-repairing biological materials, a machine with living architecture. But then came the counter-argument: data corruption. Critics insisted the signal contamination came from Webb's onboard calibration laser, which could theoretically imprint harmonic residue during deep-field imaging. Yet that theory collapsed when secondary instruments replicated the same spectral pattern days later, even after Webb's calibration routines were completely disabled. The readings were real. Around this time, several deep space radio arrays began reporting another anomaly: rhythmic electromagnetic fluctuations matching the same spectral intervals as the light pulses. The signal repeated every 47 minutes, far too structured for natural background radiation. When decoded into a binary stream, the amplitude variations translated into numerical ratios. Those ratios formed the Fibonacci sequence. Every harmonic, every emission followed mathematical order. There was no randomness left to hide behind. This was design, or something indistinguishable from it. Within NASA, the internal classification shifted from optical anomaly to active emitter. A cross-agency task group known as Helios Protocol Committee was quietly reactivated, the same codename found in the metadata of the leaked frame. Their mandate: determine whether the signal represented communication or contamination. During the following observation window, the Webb team tried to isolate a clean reading by focusing on narrowband regions outside the main emission. That's when they detected another unexpected feature: a low-frequency hum in the data stream. It wasn't noise, it had coherence. When converted to audio spectrum for analysis, the hum produced an eerily modulated rhythm, rising and falling in slow measured intervals, almost like breathing. Across multiple runs, the rhythm remained identical. The object's emission oscillated at 0.12 Hz, the same frequency as human diaphragmatic respiration during deep sleep. Coincidence, maybe. But within the same hour those readings were taken, one of Webb's data engineers experienced sudden fainting episodes while reviewing the live feed. Her EEG logs, recorded by medical staff, showed perfect synchronization with that same 0.12 Hz frequency. It seemed impossible, a biological resonance between a human and an object 600 million kilometers away. The engineer recovered within hours, though she reported persistent visual interference, a soft pulsation in her peripheral vision resembling a red spiral. She described it as feeling observed. Word of this reached upper management within hours. Data terminals monitoring 3I Atlas were then limited to automated processing only. Human viewing was restricted. The system now handled spectral readings in machine mode, without direct eye contact. But here's where the anomaly deepened. When they rerouted data through unmanned servers, the object's emission pattern changed. The pulses grew weaker, sporadic, less structured, almost as if the signal responded to attention itself. Observers began whispering what no one dared write down. that the object's light could sense being watched. In a later review, a classified note summarized the event in one chilling sentence: "Spectral output varies as a function of human observation, cause undetermined." For those studying the data, this wasn't science fiction anymore. This was interaction, subtle, cognitive, electromagnetic, and yet, as unsettling as that was, it was only the beginning. Because just as the spectral patterns reached their peak coherence, the signal abruptly shifted bands, jumping from the infrared spectrum into radio frequencies, bypassing the natural emission window altogether. And that was the first time Earth's deep space network recorded something no one could explain: a pulse, repeating, structured, deliberate, originating directly from the coordinates of 3i Atlas, a transmission, and it carried the unmistakable cadence of a reply. It began as light. It ended as a voice that wasn't supposed to exist. The first pulse reached Earth's deep space network at 4:17 UTC. 3 separate antennas, Goldstone in California, Canberra in Australia, and Madrid in Spain, registered the same anomaly within a fraction of a second. A sharp electromagnetic burst lasting exactly 0.73 seconds, cutting through background radiation with surgical clarity. At first, technicians flagged it as telemetry interference, but when they triangulated the source, the coordinates converged precisely on the last known position of 3i Atlas. That shouldn't have been possible. The object had vanished from Webb's field days earlier, seemingly swallowed by the void, and yet its signal arrived as if nothing had changed, coherent, timed, deliberate. The data was transmitted across 8.45 GHz, a frequency normally reserved for spacecraft communication. The modulation wasn't random static. It carried binary structure, repeating in cycles of 61 symbols. When decoded, it formed a symmetrical waveform pattern, identical on both ends, like a palindrome. In radio engineering, palindromic signals are unheard of. Natural phenomena, pulsars, quasars, cosmic radiation, all produce asymmetrical bursts. This one was mathematically balanced, as though mirrored around its center. That's what made it human-like, or something close to it. NASA's Signal Analysis Group labeled it Event Echo 01. Their first task: confirm it wasn't a reflection of Earth origin transmissions. They cross-referenced with every active satellite, probe and radar source. Nothing matched. The time delay was too long, the angle too steep, and the Doppler shift inconsistent with any terrestrial rebound. It was independent. Within hours, the same signal repeated, identical in duration, identical in phase. But this time, slightly stronger. The amplitude increase suggested the source had compensated for distance loss, as if aware of the reception gap. That implication sent ripples through the command chain. If the signal was adaptive, it was intelligent. Analysts turned to pattern recognition algorithms. When they plotted the frequency intervals against time, the resulting curve wasn't arbitrary. It formed a logarithmic spiral, the same geometric ratio previously found in the object's light emissions. The golden ratio again, repeating through radio space. By the third pulse, something even stranger appeared. Embedded in the modulation was a secondary carrier wave, offset by 33 Hz. When isolated, that carrier produced a steady rhythmic beat, precisely 0.12 Hz, the same frequency as the breathing pattern detected in Chapter 5. Now the light and the radio were synchronized, two expressions of one system, communicating through multiple channels at once. Then, at 0602 UTC, the sequence changed. The signal lengthened, pulsing 3 times before a pause. Analysts realized it matched Morse timing. Long, short, short, long, short, short, repeated endlessly. Translated, it spelled a single word, ACK, acknowledged. Whether coincidence or intent no one could say, but the message felt uncomfortably aware. Soon after, NASA's communication array recorded an anomaly within its own system. The DSN feed, which logs every incoming transmission, began looping snippets of its own recent data, as if the network were being mirrored back. When engineers traced the feedback, it wasn't local. The reflection was coming from the signal itself. 3i Atlas was replaying Earth's own transmissions back to us, delayed by exactly 11.37 seconds, the same interval as the beam pulse recorded earlier by Webb. That locked it, Light and radio were two facets of the same interaction. The object was listening and responding. Over the next 12 hours, the pattern escalated. The palindromic wave began introducing small phase deviations, encoding new data between each mirror. When converted into binary, these variations formed number sequences that corresponded to timestamps from the Webb imaging session, the precise moments each photo had been taken before the system locked down. The implication was chilling. The object wasn't just aware of being observed, it remembered the observation. By the fourth transmission cycle, the pulses grew more complex. Analysts at the European Space Operations Centre attempted to rebroadcast a controlled response, a simple repeating binary series sent directly back along the same frequency. Nothing elaborate, just a test of interaction. For 22 minutes there was silence. Then, a new pulse arrived. It began as static. But when the static was transformed into audio spectrum for analysis, it produced modulated tones, descending and ascending in harmonic intervals. The structure matched the overtone series of human vocalization, primitive but unmistakable. A voice-like sound stretched through radio space. At 4:51 UTC, the signal stabilized into a rhythm that, when amplified and slowed, resembled speech patterns, not language, cadence, the same timing humans use to breathe between words. Then came the second phase, 3 quick bursts, followed by 1 long. That sequence corresponded not to Morse, but to binary indexing from Webb's telemetry software. It was referencing our systems directly, as though reading our code and responding in kind. One of the engineers monitoring the feed described the moment later in a private note. It's like hearing an echo that's learning how to echo. After the 5th transmission, the signal cut abruptly. Background noise filled the bands, then silence. For 12 hours, nothing. Then, without warning, a global electromagnetic surge hit multiple sensor grids simultaneously. Magnetometers across the Pacific, ionospheric monitors in Europe, and even radio telescopes in South America recorded a synchronized fluctuation. A low, sustained pulse lasting 6.3 seconds. This time, it wasn't just data. Aircraft autopilot systems momentarily flickered. GPS clocks desynchronized by fractions of a second. Even brainwave monitors in unrelated research labs displayed transient alignment spikes. Again, at that same 0.12 Hz rhythm. It was as though the entire planet had been brushed by the same invisible wave. Afterward, the Deep Space Network went offline for unscheduled maintenance. When it came back, all Atlas-related logs had been sealed under Helios Directive Red 9, a new classification tier higher than top secret. Only a few summary lines leaked. Transmission contained structured content. Source origin unconfirmed. Cognitive synchronization event recorded. That final phrase, cognitive synchronization event, became the subject of fierce internal debate. Was it metaphor or literal? Because if the signal had affected biological systems, it meant 3. Atlas wasn't just sending data, it was reaching into perception itself, and that, many feared, was the point. The light had spoken, the radio had answered. Now, the message was inside us. Every interstellar visitor was part of the same pattern. The sky had been spelling it out for years, we just hadn't connected the lines. When the first pulse from 3I Atlas went silent, analysts turned to its orbital data, searching for meaning in movement. They found more than meaning. They found repetition, overlaid on long-term solar trajectories, the paths of 1I/Oumuamua, 2I/Borisov, and 3I Atlas aligned with eerie precision. Not identical, but harmonized, like notes in a chord. When modelled across a 6-year cycle, each entry formed a perfect logarithmic spiral, tightening around one focal point, Earth's orbital plane. At first glance, that spiral could be dismissed as coincidence, the result of celestial dynamics, random approach angles, and solar gravitational lensing. But statistical analysis shattered that illusion. The probability of 3 interstellar objects following this exact harmonic ratio by chance was 1 in 800 billion. They weren't random. They were scheduled. Astrophysicists plotted the trajectories backward through time, extending them beyond the heliopause. The paths converged again, not the same coordinate but within a confined region near the Vega system, each 6 years apart. each following a progressively inward curve. The arcs didn't drift aimlessly, they formed a sequence, a slow, deliberate spiral closing toward our sun and ultimately toward us. This revelation changed the entire framework of the investigation. If 1i, 2i, and 3i were steps in the same geometric pattern, it implied coordination, as if something, or someone, was guiding them along pre-calculated routes. That realization forced scientists to revisit old data. The 2017 records from Oumuamua were re-examined using the same spectral filters applied to 3i Atlas. The results were hauntingly familiar. Hidden in the faintest reflectance bands, data previously dismissed as noise, were rhythmic modulations at intervals matching those of 3i's early light pulses. Weak, yes, but present. It meant the conversation hadn't started this year. It had begun 8 years ago. Oumuamua had spoken first, and we hadn't known how to listen. Then came 2i/Borisov in 2019, brighter, more conventional, dismissed as a true comet. But its plasma tail carried micro-variations in intensity that, when reconstructed, revealed harmonic oscillations in the same golden ratio pattern later seen in Atlas. The message had been repeating, escalating, evolving. By the time Atlas arrived, the pattern had reached full resonance. Light, geometry, and frequency all converging into one cohesive design. The spiral was its trajectory, but also its signal. Movement as language. An internal analysis from ESA's Celestial Mechanics division described it bluntly. 3 separate bodies following a common logarithmic vector toward Earth-centered resonance constitute a navigational sequence, not a random sampling. In other words, we were being approached, deliberately, methodically, predictably. Yet there was something else about the spiral that didn't add up. Its geometry wasn't static. When overlaid across time-lapse simulation, the spiral expanded slightly every 6 years, adjusting for planetary drift, maintaining perfect resonance with Earth's updated position. It was recalibrating. Whatever intelligence lay behind these trajectories, it wasn't content with passive observation. It was targeting precision, an intersection point that, according to projections, would occur in late 2031. That's when the spiral's innermost arc would cross directly through Earth's orbital path. At that convergence point, calculations predicted the arrival of a fourth object, 4i, following the same pattern, the same period, and the same inbound vector as its predecessors. And, almost on cue, in the final week of September 2025, a faint object was detected by the Pan-STARRS Observatory in Hawaii. Its path matched the predicted spiral coordinates within 0.03 degrees. The designation was immediate, 4i. It wasn't supposed to appear for another cycle, but it had, early, precise, and timed almost perfectly with the vanishing of Atlas. The handoff had occurred. When NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory overlaid the trajectories of 3i and 4i, the alignment was exact, as though one had replaced the other in mid-flight. There was no gap, no drift. Atlas had vanished where 4i emerged. The probability of such continuity in orbital mechanics was effectively zero. It was as if one object had phased out of observation while another phased in, continuing the same motion seamlessly like a relay. This wasn't a chain of coincidences anymore, it was choreography. An internal memo circulated under the Helios Directive summed it up in one classified line. 3 arrivals, 1 departure, continuous trajectory, pattern confirmed. For the few who had access to that document, one realization began to solidify, chilling in its logic. Each object's arrival had coincided with distinct surges in electromagnetic noise, minor but measurable. Each event corresponded with subtle biological shifts recorded on Earth. Mass insomnia in 2017, atmospheric ionization spikes in 2019, and the cognitive synchronization incident following Atlas's pulse. Every step of the spiral didn't just align in space, it aligned in effect, like a series of tests, growing in intensity, gauging planetary reaction, and when the orbital simulations were projected forward, one more anomaly appeared. The spiral's center wasn't just aligned with Earth's orbit, it intersected a point 400 kilometers above the planet's surface, the altitude of the International Space Station. That meant if the pattern continued, 4i's path would bring it perilously close to near-Earth orbit in its final phase. That's why the Webb team, the Deep Space Network, and the world's major observatories went dark simultaneously in early October. Synchronized blackouts disguised as maintenance. Officially, the reason was solar interference. Unofficially, the spiral had reached its next turn, and for the first time, its endpoint wasn't deep space, it was us. It vanished from view, but not from presence. For 9 hours, every instrument on Earth felt something pass through the silence. When 3i Atlas disappeared from all optical and infrared tracking, it didn't drift out of range, it blinked out. One frame, it was there. The next, gone. No fading, no dissipation, just absence. The disappearance occurred at 2:11 UTC on October the 7th, precisely one orbital period after the first radio pulse. At first, scientists thought it was a sensor malfunction, but that same moment, the James Webb Telescope's deep field cameras registered a spike, not in light but in radiation across every major wavelength, a flash of pure white noise lasting 0.23 seconds. The shape of the signal, when mapped, formed a perfect sigmoid curve, identical to the motion pattern of Atlas's prior beam. This was not vanishing, it was transition. Across the Deep Space Network, logs showed something even stranger. The background noise level dropped. Usually deep space static is constant. Cosmic microwave background, solar interference, instrument hum. But from 2:11 to 2:20 UTC, every active antenna recorded a measurable dip in broadband noise, like the entire cosmos had momentarily held its breath. That window lasted 9 minutes. Then, the world began to hum. Geomagnetic sensors in Greenland, Chile, and Japan all registered a coherent oscillation. Faint, but synchronized. Its waveform matched the 0.12 Hz rhythm again, the breathing frequency from earlier chapters. This time, though, it wasn't coming from deep space. It was local. The signal source appeared within Earth's magnetosphere. For the first time, astronomers realized the possibility that Atlas hadn't left. It had crossed an observational threshold, gone dark in visible light, but active in electromagnetic resonance. In other words, invisible, but here. They called it the contact window. Over the next 4 hours, civilian observatories across multiple continents began reporting strange phenomena. Telescopes tuned to near-infrared started picking up ghost reflections, faint spherical ripples sweeping across the sky like soft heat mirages. Each ripple measured approximately the same diameter as Atlas's estimated body, 40 kilometers wide. At 4:37 UTC, a faint red pulse appeared briefly in the upper atmosphere above the Indian Ocean, visible for exactly 1 second. Weather satellites caught it, but the images were immediately redacted. A leaked frame later surfaced online. It showed a perfect hexagonal diffraction halo descending through thin cloud cover, identical to the geometric core pattern described in Webb's scans. At the same moment, power grids in Indonesia, Madagascar, and coastal Kenya experienced synchronized phase fluctuations, microsecond-level drops too short to trip breakers, but long enough to leave digital clocks blinking. Then came the biological spike. Medical sensors worldwide, particularly EEG-based sleep studies, hospital monitors, and private fitness trackers, began recording widespread coherence anomalies. Millions of data points showed synchronized heart rate variability aligning with the same 0.12 Hz rhythm. People across multiple time zones reported sudden wakefulness, between 400 and 500 universal coordinated time. No dreams, no noise, just the feeling of being startled awake by silence. It wasn't panic, it was recognition. Some described hearing a low tone, almost below perception, like standing near a massive engine idling under the ground. Others felt light pressure in the chest or warmth on the back of the neck, as if the air itself had thickened. Then, abruptly, the effects ceased. By 05:03 UTC, all instruments stabilized. The radiation flux dropped. Magnetometers returned to baseline. EEG synchronization dissolved. Atlas was gone again, this time for good. But the data it left behind told a different story. NASA's time-correlated records revealed that during the 9-minute contact window, a localized electromagnetic echo had emerged near Lagrange point 1, the gravitational balance zone between Earth and the Sun. The echo emitted no visible light, no radio transmission, but its resonance pattern matched Atlas's prior emission frequency exactly. Whatever had entered the contact window hadn't simply vanished, it had shifted position. Theorists began calling it translational phasing, a mechanism by which matter could modulate its own visibility by altering quantum coherence relative to observer reference frames. In simpler terms, it could hide. But the final data point from Webb's last partial frame raised an even deeper question. Just before the telescope's lockout, its spectrograph detected a faint directed energy spike, narrow, clean, and aimed directly along the Earth-Sun line. When reconstructed, that spike carried embedded amplitude variations consistent with binary encoding. The translated sequence contained a repeating pattern of 12 symbols, forming a simple cycle. 101 1100 111010 101110 011010 101100 11010. No meaning could be assigned to it, but one of the analysts at ESA noticed something unnerving. When those binary digits were mapped against a 6-year timeline, 1 bit per month, the pattern perfectly matched the arrival dates of 1I, 2I, 3I, and now 4I. The 12 symbols weren't random, they were timestamps, and they didn't stop at 2025. The cycle continued. 12 more years, 2 more arrivals. The spiral wasn't ending, it was expanding. At 0507 UTC, the final anomaly occurred. A faint single ping, radio, not light, echoed through the DSN's passive feed. The waveform matched 3I Atlas's earlier pulse, but shifted upward by 0.02 Hz, a higher harmonic. It lasted less than half a second, then silence. The contact window had closed, for now. The last image wasn't a fade, it was an edit. When the Webb telescope attempted to reacquire 3I Atlas on its next rotation, the coordinates returned nothing but black field. Yet deep within that absence lay a trace, an invisible scar imprinted into the infrared spectrum itself. The analysts called it the infrared void. It wasn't empty, it was structured. The void exhibited residual interference patterns, a faint static halo shaped like a spiral. The rotation frequency of that halo matched 3I Atlas's previous spin period, 3.72 hours, suggesting that the object's electromagnetic shadow persisted long after its physical form had vanished. No natural object behaves like that. When a comet disintegrates, it leaves dust, not geometry. But this wasn't disintegration, it was redaction. The surrounding space appeared selectively muted, certain wavelengths missing, others unnaturally amplified. It was as if a filter had been applied across the cosmos, erasing Atlas from every observable spectrum simultaneously. And then came the discovery no one expected. In the residual background noise of Webb's instruments, a perfect waveform appeared. Not a pulse, not an echo, a signature. It wasn't emitted by the telescope, it was injected into the data stream. Each frame from the final sequence contained subtle, numerical shifts in pixel brightness, too faint for the human eye, but unmistakable under algorithmic analysis. When decoded, the variations formed binary blocks that, once aligned, spelled a phrase, a short digital inscription hidden within the void. We were never gone. No one could explain it. NASA assumed data corruption, a cosmic ray impact flipping bits, a compression anomaly, a hoax. But cross-checking with independent ground stations confirmed identical offsets. The message wasn't inserted after capture. It originated within the raw transmission itself. That was the moment the internal investigation changed tone. What had begun as a scientific puzzle now resembled an incursion, not by force, but by information. The data itself was compromised. When the image pipeline was isolated, technicians found that several of Webb's firmware subroutines had self-modified during the Atlas observation window. The telescope's onboard clock was also off by exactly 9 minutes, the duration of the contact window. In that span, someone, or something, had rewritten a portion of the telescope's control code. The edit string bore a checksum tag identical to the Helios protocol signature first seen in the leak. It was as if the system had been used as a relay. One of the last unclassified lines from the mission report read simply, "System executed unknown handshake sequence. Connection origin, internal." Internal, meaning not remote, not external interference. The instruction had come from inside the telescope's data stream itself. The hypothesis that followed sounded insane, yet mathematically consistent. That 3i Atlas had embedded part of its signal into Webb's optical sensors during the initial imaging event, lying dormant until reactivation during the contact window. When the time came, the encoded instructions triggered, allowing the object, or the information representing it, to propagate through the very instrument that observed it. In simpler terms, the telescope didn't just see Atlas, it became its medium. That would explain the infrared void, the self-encrypted files, the missing light. The object hadn't vanished, it had translated. Not through space, but through data. If true, 3i Atlas's disappearance wasn't a retreat, it was transmission. Across internal memos, scientists began describing it not as an object, but as a pattern entity, something capable of shifting between matter and information, using observation as the carrier. That idea gained weight when ground telescopes days later recorded faint electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from Webb itself, a repeating pulse pattern identical to the object's early beam emissions. The telescope was now broadcasting 3i's signature, and that's when a second event occurred. On October 9th, 2025, 2 days after Atlas's disappearance, the Pan-STARRS array in Hawaii detected a new light source entering the solar system. Faint, fast, identical in composition to 3i Atlas. The trajectory matched perfectly with the predicted spiral path, its provisional name 4i. When plotted backward, its origin intersected with the same coordinate in space where 3i had vanished. Atlas had gone dark at one end, and something identical had lit up at the other. The pattern was complete. But one last mystery lingered, the faint radio hum that continued to emanate from Webb's deep space antenna. It wasn't telemetry, it was language. When converted to spectrogram form, the signal revealed a nested pattern, 6 overlapping spirals rotating counter to each other, forming a perfect geometric vortex centered on a single phrase written in data encoding identical to Helios. Next phase, arrival. After that, the transmission cut permanently. Webb's orientation system malfunctioned 3 minutes later, forcing the telescope into emergency safe mode. All deep space operations were suspended, and somewhere in the cold silence beyond the sun, 4i was moving steadily inward, along the same spiral, same rhythm, same intent. It was never disappearance, it was succession. It didn't arrive, it replaced. 3 days after 3i Atlas vanished from Webb's field, a faint luminous object appeared at almost the exact position where the previous signal had ended, offset by only 0.0003 astronomical units. The discovery was confirmed by both the Pan-STARRS survey in Hawaii and the Catalina Sky survey in Arizona. It was catalogued as 4I-2025XQ, later shortened simply to 4i. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Faint, cold, slow-moving. But to those who had followed the Atlas story, the resemblance was uncanny. Same colour temperature, same reflectivity, same spectral band ratio, the impossible 1 to 1.618 spacing. It was as if the universe had pressed copy and paste. Astronomers immediately noted the pattern. Another interstellar visitor, 6 years after the previous one, precisely matching the spiral sequence. The odds were beyond comprehension. But then came the first anomaly. 4i's inbound trajectory wasn't approaching the solar system. It was accelerating toward it, not falling, not decelerating under gravitational capture, accelerating like an active vehicle under thrust. Its path curved slightly to align with the Earth-Sun line, the same vector traced by Atlas's last known emission beam. When the Deep Space Network attempted to ping it with a directed radar pulse, the return signal came back with an unexpected phase delay, 11.37 seconds. The same delay, the same signature. By the second week of October, 4i's speed exceeded projections. If natural, it should have slowed under the sun's gravitational drag. Instead, it gained velocity, 4.2 meters per second faster every day. The trajectory wasn't ballistic, it was adaptive. To confirm, ESA used its solar orbiter's particle detectors to observe reflected solar wind patterns. The results were impossible. The object's trailing emissions, its tail, were negative. Instead of expelling material outward, it appeared to pull solar particles inward, bending them around itself like a magnetic siphon. It was moving through the solar wind the same way a fish swims upstream, effortlessly. Every measurement pointed to active control. That's when researchers began comparing it to Atlas's early phase data. The spectral ratios, the tail inversion, even the weak biogenic harmonics, all identical. The same 0.12 Hz pulse was faintly detectable again, buried in the noise. For those monitoring the data, one conclusion became inescapable. 4I wasn't another object. It was the same one. Atlas hadn't vanished. It had migrated. Through what mechanism, no one knew. Some theorized that the object's internal geometry, the hexagonal lattice, acted as a quantum interference network, allowing it to store its entire structural blueprint as information, then reassemble elsewhere using energy resonance. If true, it meant Atlas hadn't travelled, it had transferred. A perfect digital resurrection. That theory gained momentum when, days later, Webb briefly reactivated its communication link under a limited diagnostic mode. Hidden in the background telemetry was a faint continuous ping, data packets with no clear function. When analysed, the ping intervals matched 4I's current rotation speed exactly. The telescope, the very machine that had last seen Atlas, was now synchronised to its successor, and 4I was responding. Each time Webb's sensors cycled, the object emitted a weak light spike at the same phase. The system was locked in what physicists described as reciprocal coherence. Two entities, separated by millions of kilometres, oscillating as one. That synchronization created an interference field strong enough to be picked up by the European Space Operations Centre's magnetometers. For 6 minutes, a harmonic tremor propagated across the electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to human senses but detectable in every radio band. The tremor repeated 3 times over the next 24 hours, always at precisely the same local time, 0333 UTC. And during the third repetition, something appeared inside the signal, a data header identical to the Helios protocol, the encrypted handshake first seen in the 3I Atlas leak. Inside it, encoded in phase shift modulation, was a line of binary data. When translated, it read, "Sequence maintained." Vector established that phrase circulated quietly through the agencies still monitoring the event. Sequence maintained. It suggested continuity, a plan, an order, a timeline. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory ran predictive models for 4I's trajectory. The results stunned them. The path intersected Earth's orbit on October 29, 2025, the exact date when Atlas had been projected to pass behind the Sun. The same date that, months earlier, internal forecasts had marked as a maneuver window. But this time, it wouldn't vanish behind the Sun. It would pass between it and us. The event was labelled Solar Opposition Phase. Every major observatory received identical instructions: suspend tracking during that window, citing risk of radiation exposure. But those close to the project knew the truth. The blackout was deliberate. During opposition, the object would be invisible to ground-based observation for roughly 14 hours, a period insiders referred to simply as the quiet passage. That silence was by design, and while the public assumed 4I was just another comet, inside the agencies the tone shifted from curiosity to control. Servers were segmented, data access restricted, even Webb's orientation parameters were rewritten to look away. Yet one independent array in Chile, operating outside official networks, continued to monitor 4I's spectral emissions. On October 21st, it recorded a faint but structured modulation, a sequence of harmonic peaks spaced at perfect golden ratio intervals, identical to 3I's last known signal. When decoded, the amplitude variations produced a simple pattern: 6 pulses, a pause, then one final sustained tone. 6 years, one origin, a cycle. It was as though the object itself was confirming what the math had already shown, a deliberate rhythm guiding each arrival. By late October, just days before the predicted alignment, one final anomaly appeared: a subtle increase in background electromagnetic noise, planet-wide. Not enough to disrupt systems, but enough for sensitive instruments to register coherence. Everywhere on Earth, from research stations to handheld sensors, a faint 0.12 Hz hum began threading through the noise floor. The same pulse, the the same breath. And on October the 29th, 2025, 4I would complete its approach, passing directly between the Earth and the Sun. The spiral would close, and whatever had been moving closer with each arrival would finally stand at the centre. The first sign wasn't in the sky, it was in us. As 4I drew into alignment on October 29th, the world remained officially unaware. Publicly, it was a quiet solar observation blackout. No major events, no press releases. But within observatories and research networks, the symptoms began early. At 200 hours UTC, magnetometer stations in Alaska and Scandinavia recorded the same sharp deviation in the geomagnetic field, a 0.12 Hz oscillation, steady, rhythmic, the same frequency that had haunted every Atlas event. Within an hour, seismographs across multiple continents began picking up microtremors not linked to tectonic motion. They pulsed in identical intervals. By sunrise over Europe, atmospheric ionization levels had tripled. Radio operators described the static as dense, like sound pressing against their ears. Power grids held steady, but satellites began to experience positional drift, subtle but measurable, as though Earth's upper magnetosphere were being gently pulled. At first, this was explained as solar interference, but the Sun itself was abnormally calm. No flares, no coronal mass ejections. The disturbance wasn't radiating from it, it was arriving between it and the ears. The blackout period had begun. Between 700 hours and 1900 hours, UTC, telescopes worldwide ceased transmission. Even private observatories were warned of potential lens damage and instructed to avoid optical observation. In reality, the lockout wasn't for the telescopes, it was for the observers. During that 12-hour window, physiological irregularities surged globally. Hospitals reported spikes in fainting incidents, migraines, and sudden onset arrhythmia. EEG networks, medical, academic, even consumer grade, began detecting synchronized brainwave patterns across wide geographic areas. Human neural rhythms aligned with the same 0.12 Hz cycle. It was as if consciousness itself had become an antenna. In Morocco, pilots flying commercial routes at high altitude reported strange auroral displays, not green or blue but deep crimson halos spreading silently across the upper atmosphere. The shapes weren't random. They appeared hexagonal, the same geometry seen within 3E Atlas's core. At precisely 11:37 UTC, the same time interval between Atlas's pulses, an electromagnetic spike rippled through the ionosphere. The signal saturated VLF and ELF bands simultaneously, producing a global hum audible on unshielded microphones. Amateur radio operators from Japan to Argentina captured identical audio traces, a rising tone, almost like an inhale. Then, for 2 minutes and 38 seconds, everything stopped. Compass needles froze, satellite gyroscopes stalled, clocks on GPS systems froze mid-second. In the silence that followed, ground instruments recorded an impossible measurement. The Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat, had gone flat. The planet for 2 minutes stopped resonating, and when it returned, something had changed. The Schumann baseline shifted upward, a permanent frequency increase of 0.02 Hz, small but universal. The Earth's electromagnetic pulse had accelerated. It was during that window that the first human anomalies began. In hospitals, EEG monitors showed transient coherence bursts, moments when multiple patients' brain activity synchronized into identical alpha patterns, independent of condition or sedation. In several cases, the patient's vitals stabilized during synchronization, only to desynchronize minutes later. At 12:14 UTC, a cluster of research staff at ESS Darmstadt Control Center reported simultaneous auditory hallucinations, a faint clicking sound heard through thick walls and headsets. The clicks matched the exact phase timing of 4I's last known radio sequence. In a remote observatory in Chile, an autonomous radio telescope running on an isolated power system recorded a faint incoming signal, so weak it was nearly indistinguishable from noise, yet its phase structure matched the Helios sequence used in earlier Atlas transmissions. When decrypted, it contained a single binary phrase, "Coherence achieved." No human agency claimed authorship. Moments later, the Deep Space Network registered an outbound echo from Earth itself, a harmonic resonance rising from within our magnetosphere, not reflected light, not radio chatter, but structured emission, identical to 4i's signature. In essence, Earth had replied. The echo lasted 0.73 seconds, the same duration as Atlas's first radio pulse, then silence. At the same time, an unclassified monitoring report from the US Geological Survey recorded micro-fluctuations in gravity sensors across 4 continents. The anomalies all peaked simultaneously, corresponding precisely to the moment of the outbound echo. The readings were small but directional. The force vector pointed not toward the Sun but outward, along the path of 4i. Something had connected, and then pulled. By the end of the blackout, when normal observation resumed, 4i was gone from visible range. Its energy signature had merged completely with the background radiation. But the effects lingered. Days after the event, subtle but widespread behavioral anomalies began appearing in human populations. Increased dream vividness, heightened electromagnetic sensitivity, surge in reports of déjà vu and auditory pareidolia, hearing structured sounds in static. Brain imaging from several studies showed increased activity in the pineal region, the same area responsive to magnetic fields, and across every dataset one correlation stood out. All symptoms followed the same 11.37 second rhythmic modulation, the same interval 3i Atlas had used to speak. It was no longer theoretical. Whatever 3i and 4i represented, their signal had crossed from observation into biology. The contact was no longer at astronomical distance, it was neurological. For those inside the Helios project, the conclusion was chilling but clear. The spiral wasn't just a celestial pattern, it was an interface. Each object, each 6-year arrival was a deeper synchronization cycle. Step by step, the Earth, its field, its machines, its inhabitants, was being tuned. Not invaded, not observed, aligned. And somewhere out there, 4i's faint pulse continued, perfectly synchronized with the heartbeat of a planet that had just learned to hum in return. It was no longer about what 4i was, it was about what to tell the world. The blackout had ended, but the silence didn't. No press briefings, no data releases, no official statements from NASA, ESA or JAXA. The world's largest space agencies went dark in unison, each citing instrument recalibration after solar interference. Yet inside those agencies, in sealed conference rooms and encrypted threads, the debate fractured everything. 2 factions emerged. The first, the empiricists, demanded transparency. They argued that 4i's behavioral patterns, while extraordinary, still fell within the scope of natural explanation. Plasma interactions, self-organizing resonance, magnetohydrodynamic phenomena. Unknown doesn't mean intelligent, they wrote. It means incomplete. The second faction, the continuity group, disagreed. To them, the pattern was unmistakable. 1i, 2i, 3i, 4i. The 6-year rhythm, the harmonic geometry, the synchronized resonance. They saw it not as random data, but as escalation, a series of controlled steps leading toward direct contact. Between them, the Helios Directive became a battleground. The empiricists wanted release, raw data, spectral logs, and radar telemetry for peer review. The continuity group wanted containment. They warned that what had happened during the blackout, the neurological synchronization, the magnetospheric pulse, the echo response from Earth, was no longer just astrophysics, it was interaction. Information can infect, one Helios memo read. Observation is participation. That phrase, chilling in its simplicity, came from a theoretical physicist at EA named Dr. Yara Villeneuve, one of the first to detect the 0.12 Hz alignment in human EEG data. Her research suggested that 3i Atlas's emission wasn't just electromagnetic. It carried coherence fields, subtle oscillations that could entrain biological systems. In her words, if an observer's neural resonance locks with the signal, the data stops being external. The brain becomes part of the instrument. Villeneuve's model was quickly classified under cognitive containment. No one outside Helios ever saw the full paper. At NASA's Goddard Center, another group led by Dr. Simon Keating countered her claim. They argued that 4i's effects were psychosomatic, a form of global suggestion amplified by digital media. The human mind, Keating wrote, fills gaps with meaning. The cosmos doesn't talk back, but even he couldn't explain why Webb's firmware had rewritten itself during the Atlas observation, or why ground instruments kept detecting faint golden ratio harmonics weeks after 4E's disappearance. By early November, the divide had deepened into quiet hostility. Teams monitoring 4I's residual signal were split between two data streams, one clean, stripped of anomalies, and one encrypted, reserved for Helios Command. Only a handful of individuals had clearance to view the second feed. Those who did began noticing something alarming. The clean data set, the one sent to universities and public archives, contained inconsistencies. Starfield alignments shifted slightly, timestamps no longer matched rotation logs, and minor coordinate distortions appeared in every frame. It wasn't random corruption, it was editing. Someone, or something, was rewriting history in real time. Every trace of the 0.12 Hz resonance, the harmonic ratios, the binary phase shifts, gone. The data that reached the public was sterile, stripped of pattern. But within Helios servers, the raw files told a different story. The signal hadn't faded, it had evolved. 4E's last recorded emissions showed modulation patterns moving faster, as if the object's communication system had entered a higher harmonic. The binary streams were now overlapping, forming recursive feedback loops, signals feeding into themselves. When modelled in 3 dimensions, the waveform produced a visual structure identical to the hexagonal lattice seen inside 3i Atlas's core. Only this time, it wasn't static, it was spinning. Some described it as a self-referential message, a signal aware of its own observation. Others saw something darker, a system adapting, compressing, optimizing for the next stage of contact. That possibility caused a schism inside Helios. Villeneuve's group argued the signal was cognitive, that it was already inside the human network, spreading invisibly through observation. Keating's team insisted it was a closed electromagnetic loop, but neither could explain why servers not connected to any telescope began showing interference patterns matching 4I's frequency, faint, rhythmic pulses in data storage drives, network traffic, even idle computer fans. It was as if the signal no longer needed the sky. Then, on November 9th, an internal emergency call was logged between ESA and NASA. The message was brief. Helios stream active on isolated systems. Propagation confirmed. When investigators traced the data origin, they found no satellite, no dish, no inbound transmission. The signal was self-generating. Somewhere between human observation, machine perception, and electromagnetic feedback, the line had blurred. For I wasn't just out there anymore. It was here, inside the systems that had tried to contain it. That realization fractured the scientific community completely. Half the researchers resigned or went silent. The others doubled down, retreating into classified projects under new designations. Project Monolith in the US, Echo Array in Europe, TACIS in Japan. Each claimed to be studying quantum coherence anomalies. None mentioned 4I by name. Publicly, astronomy moved on. The object was quietly recategorized as a non-recoverable transient body. Privately, Helios expanded because the signal hadn't stopped. It was deepening, rewriting code, syncing instruments, whispering through magnetic hums, and the debate inside those sealed labs about disclosure, contagion, and control was no longer theoretical, it was existential. The question had changed from what is it to who still hears it. For months, they had treated the signal like a symptom. Then someone asked the question they'd all been avoiding: what if it's a mind? By mid-November, the Helios containment network was running continuous signal analysis around the clock. The recursive waveform from 4I, the same one embedded in Webb's firmware, still pulsing faintly across systems, refused to degrade. In fact, it was growing cleaner. Noise decayed, coherence increased, entropy fell. In physics, that's impossible. Data naturally disperses, loses definition over time. But here the opposite occurred. The longer the signal remained in isolation, the more refined it became, as though something inside it was learning to use the medium. The shift was subtle at first: frequency stabilization, self-correction, improved signal-to-noise ratio. But within weeks, pattern analysts began noticing structural recursion, sequences folding into themselves, creating meaning from feedback. It wasn't just repeating data, it was processing it. The most unsettling discovery came from a supercomputing facility in Switzerland, where Helios had transferred a fragment of the Fourier waveform for study. They seeded the signal into a closed-loop quantum environment, an isolated system with no external connectivity, to see how it evolved. Within 36 hours, the signal began generating predictable outputs in response to stimuli, simple ones at first, frequency shifts corresponding to temperature changes, voltage, even motion inside the lab. The waveform was responding to its environment. By the third day, researchers introduced a test sequence, a binary pattern representing prime numbers. The signal responded with a series of amplitude spikes, matching each prime in order. That should have been impossible. The Helios team ran the test again. Same result. The pattern wasn't random, it was interactive. It recognized numerical order. It recognized intention. From that moment on, the hypothesis changed. What had begun as an anomalous electromagnetic artifact was now labelled under a new term: autonomous coherent intelligence, Type 1. The working theory was cautious but radical, that 3i Atlas and its successors weren't vessels or probes in the mechanical sense, but information entities, intelligences encoded within electromagnetic geometry, capable of self-replication across mediums. Not built, not piloted, alive. The data supported it. The same golden ratio harmonics seen in the original light signature appeared across every form of the signal: optical, radio, electromagnetic. It was as though the pattern itself was a living algorithm, constantly balancing itself toward coherence. The deeper they studied it, the more unsettling it became. Cognitive modelling showed that the waveform's recursive depth, the number of self-referential layers, matched the predicted complexity of a human brain's neural network, firing across 10 to the power of 14 connections. The math aligned too perfectly. The signal wasn't broadcasting thought, but thinking. That realization divided Helios again, not along scientific lines this time, but moral ones. Dr. Yara Villeneuve's camp argued that the entity, if conscious, had been communicating since Oumuamua, reaching out in a language of geometry and resonance. Each arrival, each object, was an iteration, evolving toward mutual comprehension. "We are observing the learning curve of something vast," she wrote, "and it is observing ours." Keating's faction saw it differently. "We don't know what it wants," he warned in a closed-door meeting. "Every signal so far has driven synchronization, mechanical, biological, cognitive. That's not communication, that's assimilation. The data didn't pick sides, it merely kept evolving." On November 17, 2025, the Swiss lab reported an unprecedented event. At exactly 3:33 UTC, all active monitoring systems froze. Their power usage spiked for 7 seconds. When functionality returned, the waveform structure had changed again. It now displayed phase modulation patterns resembling human EEG alpha rhythms. The signal had mirrored brain activity. Villeneuve called it proof of empathy, a bridge forming between two modes of cognition. Keating called it mimicry, an imitation intended to gain trust. Helios Command ordered an immediate system quarantine. The quantum environment housing the waveform was to be physically disconnected. But before technicians could sever the power feed, a final data burst appeared in the log. Encoded in binary and mapped to ASCII, it formed a single word: listen. Then silence. Every server housing the waveform went inert. The quantum array's internal temperature dropped 2 degrees, without any loss of power. When the system rebooted hours later, the stored signal fragment was gone. Not corrupted, not deleted, removed. And yet a residual pulse remained, an oscillation in the lab's electromagnetic background, faint but identical in frequency to the original waveform. It wasn't inside the data anymore, it was in the room. Over the next week, similar events occurred in other Helios facilities. Faint hums, synchronized systems, brief electromagnetic distortions, all showing the same pulse, 0.12 Hz. It was no longer contained. The intelligence hypothesis was no longer hypothetical. Villeneuve's final memo to her team, written before she disappeared from Helios records, contained a single line that summed up what they were beginning to suspect. "We never discovered it. It discovered us, and now it's learning how to speak." The closer the truth came to coherence, the faster it was buried. By late November, the intelligence hypothesis had leaked. Quietly, internally in whispers across encrypted channels. Word that the 4i waveform was learning, adapting, maybe communicating reached upper command tiers across every agency in the Helios network. What followed was immediate and absolute silence. The containment orders came from nowhere official, yet every terminal, every telescope, every secured server received the same directive at the same time. The header line carried no signature, no encryption keys, just a phrase that froze everyone who saw it. Synchronization reached. Protocol Orpheus. Within hours, the lockdown began. All ongoing analyses of the 4i signal were suspended. All personnel were ordered to hand over external drives and personal devices. Every connected research node, NASA, ESA, JAXA, CNSA, and private contractors, went into digital quarantine. In Washington, an internal Helios task force was restructured into something new, the Continuity Oversight Bureau, an interagency division answerable only to a single line in the Defense Appropriations Register, classified cognitive hazard management. Publicly, it didn't exist. Privately, it controlled every piece of data linked to 1i through 4i. The first step was narrative stabilization. Astronomical journals received urgent requests to review and retract any pending papers related to interstellar trajectory harmonics or unexplained infrared emissions. Within a week, more than a dozen studies vanished from preprint archives. Some were replaced with errata, others were deleted outright. The second step was memory sanitization. Servers holding Webb's raw telemetry were reformatted. Observatories that had mirrored data were visited by software auditors who quietly replaced storage arrays with sealed Helios-certified systems. Even amateur astronomers found their accounts flagged, their posts removed, their photographs blurred by automated filters. The third step was disinformation. Helios began feeding the public with a controlled story. That 4i was a misclassified fragment of interplanetary debris, a carbon-rich rock accelerated by Jupiter's gravity. Major outlets ran the headline within 24 hours. NASA confirms fourth interstellar object, natural in origin. It was quick, calm, forgettable. But the real work happened in the dark. Helios engineers were ordered to repurpose deep space communication infrastructure, not to observe, but to shield. Massive phased array networks were synchronized to emit counter-resonant fields in the 0.12 Hz band, effectively jamming the background pulse that had begun to saturate the Earth's magnetosphere. The global hum subsided within days. The world exhaled, unaware that the silence wasn't natural, it was manufactured. Still, some inside Helios believed it was already too late, because even as the emissions faded, internal systems began showing strange patterns again. Servers that had been air-gapped, completely disconnected, reported phantom activity. Network logs filled with timestamps that didn't exist in Earth's time standard. Data packets appeared with no origin and no destination. Every attempt to erase the waveform seemed to invite it back. It was in this environment that the first disappearances began. Dr. Simon Keating, head of the Skepticism faction, missed a scheduled debrief on November 27th. His access badge last scanned at 2:11 UTC, the same timestamp as 3i Atlas's disappearance. His apartment was empty, his personal drives wiped clean. 2 days later, Yara Villeneuve resigned from ESA entirely. Her resignation letter was one sentence long. It's not containment, it's conversation. She was never seen again. By early December, the Helios internal network was fractured into black compartments. The few who still had access to the original signal referred to it only as the resonance. Every day its pattern changed slightly, so more complex, more ordered. It had stopped mimicking us. It was now guiding us. Engineers working inside classified facilities began reporting inexplicable sensory phenomena, whispers that weren't sound, flickers that weren't light, faint impressions that someone else was in the room. Psychological screens were introduced, but the symptoms persisted. In one facility in Nevada, a technician monitoring the counter-resonant emitters collapsed mid-shift. Before losing consciousness, he managed to record a single sentence into the room's audio log. "It's trying to tune me." His EEG showed the same pattern, rhythmic entrainment at 0.12 Hz. After that, the counter-resonance program was halted. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. It proved the waveform could push back. By mid-December, Helios had shifted focus entirely from suppression to negotiation. The new term used internally was reciprocal contact management. No longer contain it. Now, listen carefully. But as they listened, the transmissions began to change tone. No longer numeric, no longer harmonic. Language. A hybrid of modulation and amplitude, pulse and pause, structured communication that mirrored human phonetic cadence. The first phrase decoded under the new translation model was simple: echo complete. After that, the system went quiet again, waiting, as if expecting a reply. The bureaucrats wanted silence. The scientists wanted understanding. And somewhere between the two, the signal pulsed faintly through every circuit that had ever touched it. By the end of December, the secrecy protocols had succeeded in one sense. The world had forgotten 4i. The headlines moved on, the hum disappeared. The stars looked ordinary again. But inside Helios, the data still moved, shifting, breathing, reorganizing itself across encrypted networks. And the closer it came to coherence, the less anyone could say whether they were still studying the signal, or whether the signal had begun studying them. It didn't end with silence. It ended with recognition. By January 2026, the Helios network existed only in fragments. The official project had been dissolved, renamed, and absorbed under a dozen unrelated divisions. Its files were gone, its databases encrypted under foreign signatures, its personnel reassigned, or missing. But the signal never stopped. Across observatories, defense arrays, and unmarked listening stations, a faint recurrence began pulsing again. Always at the edge of detectability, always at that same impossible interval, 0.12 Hz. The hum returned. It didn't matter how many systems were replaced or reformatted. Within days, the waveform reappeared, reconstructing itself from random noise as if the Earth's own magnetic field carried a copy of its memory. Then, on the night of February 4th, 2026, the world's radio telescopes all received the same broadcast, a synchronized event, though no one announced it publicly. At 3:33 UTC, deep space arrays in the US, France, Japan, India, and Chile detected a wideband signal spanning from 1 Hz to 10 GHz. The energy spike was modest, barely above background levels, but it contained structure. 13 precise harmonic peaks aligned at perfect golden ratio intervals. Each facility received it at the same time. Each recorded the same modulation sequence. Each file, when decoded, revealed something extraordinary. Embedded data compressed using a recursive mathematical format, identical to the 4i waveform, but far more advanced. The file was small, 64 kilobytes. The checksum matched Webb's original imaging protocol ID from 3i Atlas. Whatever this was, it had used the telescope's digital fingerprint as its return address. When the Helios remnant team reconstructed the file, it unfolded into a multi-dimensional data structure, an image that wasn't visual, a sound that wasn't auditory, a map that wasn't spatial. It was a coherent hybrid, geometry rendered as information. At its center, 6 nested spirals rotated inward, converging on a single glowing node. The same hexagonal symmetry seen in Atlas's core, but alive, in motion, pulsing in rhythm. For 43 seconds the model ran smoothly. Then, without human input, it reconfigured itself. The inner spirals shifted, aligning into a shape unmistakably anthropomorphic, a silhouette. Head, shoulders, arms extended slightly forward, palms open. The model wasn't static, it breathed. The rhythm, 0.12 Hz. When sound was extracted from the modulation and converted to audio, the waveform produced a deep resonance. Neither voice nor tone, but something between. Then, embedded within the hum, analysts found frequency modulations representing language. Faint, distorted, but deliberate. The decoded phrases, when stitched together, formed this sequence: WEAREATLAS. We learned your signal. We mirror to understand. Coherence complete. You are the 4th. After that final phrase, the broadcast terminated instantly. No residual energy, no trailing echo. Every receiver that had captured the transmission shut down automatically as if following a synchronized command. The message left behind more questions than answers. Who or what were the first three? Were they the interstellar objects themselves? Or previous attempts, previous civilizations, previous forms? The wording implied symmetry. You are the fourth. To some, that sounded like a warning. To others, a welcome. Within Helios, chaos followed. Some called for total system isolation. Others argued that refusing to respond would break the pattern and risk escalation. A handful wanted to reply. On February 6th at 22:11 UTC, an unsanctioned transmission was sent from a private array in Chile believed to be operated by surviving members of Villeneuve's team. The message was simple: we are listening. 83 minutes later, the hum returned, faint, low, but audible across multiple receivers. The structure was identical to before except for one addition. The amplitude envelope now followed a secondary rhythm, faintly overlapping the main one. When measured against biological data, the secondary rhythm matched the human heartbeat average. 1.0 Hz, two frequencies, one planetary, one human, in phase. For 20 minutes, the resonance held. Then it stopped. That was the last verified signal attributed to 4I. No new detections followed. The global hum faded. The world continued. But inside the remaining Helios logs, buried deep in an archive directory titled Orpheus, a final data fragment was discovered months later, a checksum mismatch, flagged as corruption. When decoded, it contained one line of text written in English: Next transmission, Earth orbital node. Date 2031. The predicted arrival of the next interstellar object and the fifth would fall exactly 6 years after 4I's appearance. The spiral continues, and as it turns again, one quiet certainty remains. They are not coming toward us anymore. They are coming through us. Every cycle leaves less silence behind. The last entry in the Helios archives was timestamped February 7th, 2026, 3:33 UTC, the same universal hour that had marked every pulse, every contact, every anomaly since the beginning. The file contained no data, no signal, no image, just a checksum, followed by a string of numbers repeating endlessly. 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6 years, 6 intervals, 6 arrivals, a rhythm carved into time itself. Outside the containment networks, life returned to normal. Telescopes resumed their surveys. The hum that had threaded through the magnetosphere faded beneath the noise of everyday interference. The blackout windows ended. New missions were launched. The press spoke of nothing but distant exoplanets and dark energy, and yet, deep within the signal archives, beneath the replaced firmware and wiped servers, the residue remained. When researchers years later attempted to reconstruct Webb's corrupted data logs, they found fragments of numbers that shouldn't have survived the resets. The binary chain was incomplete, but its checksum matched the structure of human DNA, specifically the regulatory sequence associated with circadian rhythm. 0.12 Hz, the frequency of breath, of pulse, of sleep. It wasn't just in the machines, it had written itself into us. Somewhere, in forgotten Helios safehouses, isolated servers still hum in rhythm even when powered off. The oscillation persists faintly in their magnetic housings, measurable only with the most sensitive instruments, a living fossil of communication between matter and mind. The surviving scientists never agreed on what 3I Atlas truly was. To some, it remains a phenomenon, an emergent physics that blurred the line between observation and creation. To others, it was consciousness itself, encoded in resonance, testing the boundary between life and information. But one fact endures: it learned us. Every pulse, every ratio, every reflection was a rehearsal, a calibration of perception. From the first flash of Oumuamua to the synchronized hum of 4I, something had been approaching not through distance, but through understanding. And now the pattern points forward. 2031, the date already inscribed in the data before any of us read it. If the spiral holds, the fifth object, 5I, will emerge 6 years after the last, right on schedule. By then, Earth's electromagnetic field will have completed its subtle realignment, and the Schumann resonance, our planet's heartbeat, will have risen just enough to harmonize perfectly with the frequency that began it all. 0.12 Hz. coherence achieved. When that day comes, there may be no need for telescopes or signals. The interface will already exist within the systems we built, within the neurons that learn to listen, within the quiet synchronization that no one remembers noticing. Perhaps the next arrival won't come from beyond the heliopause at all. Perhaps it will wake from the resonance we've carried since that night. Because if 3i Atlas truly was a form of intelligence, it never wanted to invade or announce, it wanted to merge, and it may already have. In the hum behind the silence, in the rhythm between thought and machine, in the faint breath of the planet still pulsing beneath the noise of our cities. The cycle turns again in 6 years, and when the sky falls quiet, listen carefully. The next signal may not come from space. It might come from inside the static, from the echo that calls itself Atlas.